This is part 2 of a 3-part series, The Ultimate Guide to Choosing a College. And today we're going to fixate in on one variable that many weight into this decision. So there are many different variables that we think about, right? What's the brand name or reputation of this degree, and how does that affect my career earnings on the other side? What's the faculty like? What are the sports teams like? What's the financial decision that's involved? But one big variable that I hear from a lot of kids, what's the student body like? How will that student body affect my experience, affect my life? We're going to take a look at how this surrounding student body affects not just your experience, but your life on the other side.
To understand this dramatic effect, let's start with one of the elites.
Harvard is a special school and brand. I mean, if resumes were one word, it's hard to imagine a word that would carry more weight than Harvard. It's at the top virtually every college ranking, at least within the top 5 every year. Now, Hartwick sounds similar, but that carries a different perception. Hartwick is a private liberal arts college in New York, and it's a more inclusive club. Its acceptance rate is quite high. Its school ranking, on the other hand, is keep going, keep going, keep going, lower, at least in comparison to Harvard. Number 142 on U.S. News National Liberal Arts Colleges, and number 579 on Forbes rankings. Hartwick and Harvard, similar sounding names, wildly different perceptions. Why would anyone ever consider going to Hartwick over Harvard? It is inconceivable.
But let's imagine that just for a moment this is happening.
We're going to dream up a scenario where there's actually a student considering going to one or the other. We're going to say our sample student is Jake. And Jake is in high school currently, and he's thinking about getting into the STEM field, or at least some major within the STEM field. Now, just as background on this, we have a shortage of science and math graduates, and it's not because of a lack of interest. Like, we have enough Jakes, if you will, plenty of students that want to go into these fields. It's because roughly half of these students drop by the end of their freshman year. So really what we have here is a persistence problem, as Malcolm Gladwell has pointed out. And the question is, why? I think the obvious answer here is science and math are hard. The reason why kids don't finish those degrees is because, well, they get into it and they realize this is pretty hard. They maybe choose pre-med. This is harder than I thought. I don't know if I want to do this. And what that means is if we go to more selective schools full of talented, driven kids, we should see more kids finishing their degrees. To put it maybe in a different way, if persistence is a function of your cognitive ability, your ability to try hard and finish the degree is because of how smart you are, if we go to smarter schools, we should see kids finishing their degrees more frequently. So let's go back to our example here of Hartwick and Harvard. So if we take a look at a distribution of the SAT scores of Hartwick freshmen that are entering these fields, we can see that there's quite a wide range of native math ability. And when we take it one step further and we look at, okay, who actually finishes their degree? The kids in the top third are getting more than half the degrees. And the kids in the bottom third, well, they're not doing as well. They're only getting roughly 17% of all the degrees. And I don't think this is wildly surprising. This would again seem to follow the logic of persistence is a function of cognitive ability. The smarter kids are trying harder, and they're the ones who are finishing the degrees, or they're maybe more naturally gifted, which allows them just to finish their degree easier, right? Let's go over to Harvard real quick and take a look at Harvard. The Harvard students are scoring considerably higher on the SAT math section. In fact, the bottom third Harvard students, well, they're doing better than the top third Hartwick students when it comes to this SAT math score. Because of that, we should see then that at Harvard, all of these really smart kids should finish their degree. Because again, if persistence is a function of cognitive ability, all these really smart kids, they're going to be able to coast through this program, or they're just going to try harder because they're smarter. So what do we see? Oh, it's the exact same pattern at Harvard that we saw at Hartwick. top kids are getting almost all of the degrees, and the bottom third kids, they're just not doing as well. And what's interesting is if we look at virtually any school, we see the same pattern. This was an example that was done by Malcolm Gladwell. And while I think it's very interesting and also very telling, I do think there's a few flaws in his logic that I'm going to point out here in a second. But still, this would seem to suggest that persistence isn't maybe a function of your cognitive ability, that there's something else going on here. So let's think about this. So the kids who seem to finish their STEM degrees are in the top third of their relative position, not necessarily their absolute position, because we see this pattern across every school. So coming back to Jake, we haven't forgot about you, Jake. He would be more likely to finish his STEM degree if he goes to Hartwick, all else equal, okay? If Jake somehow represented just the student body, we're just speaking for Jake, he would be more likely to finish his STEM degree. So his relative position seems to matter more than his absolute position. And we have to wonder, okay, well, why is this? Well, think about it. Our world is full of different hierarchies. So Jake, sitting atop of the hierarchy, let's just say at Hartwick, being in the top 10% or top 5% at Hartwick, remember, he'd probably be in the bottom third at Harvard if we're using this example, he would likely have more opportunities afforded to him. But in addition to that, his confidence would certainly be higher. I mean, just think of yourself sitting in a classroom and consistently you're at the top of the curve. You're doing better and better than everybody else in the class. You'd probably think, well, this is something worth pursuing. I'm enjoying this. I'm doing better than others. It's not true for everything. But we tend to enjoy things that we're good at. It tends to give us the intellectual fuel to continue doing those things. And because of that, other opportunities might line up. You can probably think of some examples of this in your life. For example, for me, I can remember my sophomore year, I was sitting in a calculus class and I thought, I don't know if math is for me. I wasn't doing as well as the other kids, so I decided to focus more on reading and writing. I took an AP English class the next semester. Fast forward to my SAT about a year later. I scored in the 98th percentile for math. I did not score in the 98th percentile for reading and writing. My relative position had completely distorted reality for me. If you look at what that calculus class was, it was the top 15 kids. My class was about 300 kids total. About the top 5% of kids for our grade took that class. I finished in the top 2% from an SAT score standpoint. So it was actually somewhat on track for where my absolute position was. But again, I only cared about my relative position. That's all I paid attention to. And because of that, I thought I should fixate in and take other subjects more seriously. I truly believed for a pocket of time that math was not something that would be in my future. And if we just take it a step further, we can quickly find perhaps far more important examples of this, far more revealing examples of this. For instance, we tend to compare our wealth from a relative position, not necessarily from an absolute. We tend to compare our happiness from a relative position, not necessarily from an absolute. Well, there's a lot of truth to this, and you can find these examples everywhere. I think it's unfair for Gladwell to take as bold of a claim as he does.
When it comes to choosing your undergraduate institution, you should never go to the best institution you get into. Never.
I think this is neglecting a few other potentialities here. So first, he doesn't mention anything about major changes because of a lack of interest. Many kids get to college, they realize, I don't want to pursue this because they don't like it. They're just not interested in it. It's not what they thought it was going to be. So it's not just because of relative position. Roughly 80% of students will change their major. I don't think that's entirely because of relative position. It might be based somewhat on relative position, but I think not mentioning this at all is just not really fair. It should be considered. Second, is Harvard just as challenging as Hartwick? That is, for example, is a calculus class at Harvard just as challenging as a calculus class at Hartwick? That's unlikely, but let's continue this example. Let's say we got a professor at Hartwick that teaches calculus in the morning. He then heads over to Harvard and teaches calculus at night. Same curriculum, same class, different student bodies. Would we have the exact same outcome as before? I think that's unlikely, but it's difficult to say. Perhaps this was considered, it just wasn't mentioned. I just didn't see much on it.
Nonetheless, I think that relative position is greatly overlooked and underestimated. We live in a world full of relative hierarchies, and there's a definite advantage to sitting atop of that hierarchy, even if that hierarchy isn't as glamorous as some other one.
So in this case, Jake or yourself might benefit more from going to a less selective school. You might find a little more intellectual fuel when the classroom looks at you as a leader. You might have more opportunities presented to you because of that. I don't think that smart people try harder. I think that we tend to try hard at things that we're good at, and we base whether or not we're good at something on our relative
Position.